The crack of breaking glass cut through the music of the Oak Ridge Country Club ballroom like a rifle shot. It wasn't an accident. My daughter-in-law, Natalie, had not dropped her wine glass. She had slammed it down on the table with enough force to shatter the stem, and she had done it while looking directly into my eyes. The chatter at the surrounding tables fell away. The string quartet in the corner faltered and stopped. 200 guests turned to look at the commotion near the head table, where my 65th birthday celebration had just become something else entirely. I didn't move. I stood at the edge of the table, still holding the speech I had been about to give, and I looked at the red wine spreading across the white linen like a wound. I had paid for that tablecloth. I had paid for everything in this room: the flowers, the food, the open bar, the private chef flown in from Charleston. I had paid for the custom dress Natalie was wearing, because when my son Brendan had come to me 3 weeks ago and said the budget was running short, I had written the check without asking a single question. 20 minutes earlier, she had pulled me aside near the bar and told me exactly what she wanted in exchange for her patience. She wanted me to sign the lake house over to them, tonight, before the cake was cut. My lake house in the Blue Ridge Mountains. 4 acres, 3,000 square feet, built by my own hands on weekends over 5 years while Brendan was still in middle school. My late wife, Patricia, had called it the only place in the world that felt like a held breath. She had painted watercolors on the back porch every summer until she couldn't anymore. Her easel was still there, her last canvas, an unfinished view of the water at dusk, still hung in the master bedroom because I could not bring myself to move it. When I told Natalie no, she smiled at me with a patience that was more frightening than anger. She leaned in close enough that I could smell the champagne on her breath and whispered that she and Brendan had already spoken to an attorney. She said that at 65, with a history of blood pressure issues and what she described as increasing forgetfulness, I might have some difficulty managing a second property on my own. She said the family was concerned. She said the word family, the way a judge says verdict. I told her the answer was still no. That was when she walked back to the head table and broke the glass. Now she stood there with her chest rising and falling, and her eyes bright with a fury she had stopped trying to conceal. Around us, 200 people were watching. Business partners I had known for 30 years. My daughter Ellen and her husband, who had flown in from Portland. The mayor of the county, whom I had helped elect twice. They were all watching my daughter-in-law stand in the ruins of my birthday party and wait to see what the old man would do. I set my speech down on the table. I pressed my hand flat against the paper to smooth it, and I looked at Natalie for a long moment. Then I looked at my son. Brendan was sitting 2 chairs down, and I want to tell you that he was horrified. I want to tell you that the man I raised, the boy I had coached through Little League and driven to SAT prep, and walked across the stage at his college graduation, was sitting there with his jaw tight and his eyes on his wife with something hard and protective rising in them. I want to tell you that he stood up. He did not stand up. He was looking at his phone. I excused myself from the table with the kind of quiet that people remember long after the noise is forgotten. I nodded to the head waiter to let the music start again. I picked up my glass of water and walked out through the side exit into the corridor that ran behind the kitchen, where the noise of the party became a low murmur, and the only light came from the recessed fixtures along the ceiling. I found a chair near the service entrance and sat down. I was 65 years old and I had been standing for 3 hours and my hip ached, and for a moment I was just a tired man sitting in a hallway trying to remember what his wife's voice sounded like when she laughed. Then I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out my phone. I had kept one person off the guest list tonight. Not because I didn't trust her, but because I had hoped, with the specific and irrational optimism of a father, that I wouldn't need her. Margaret Voss had been the chief legal officer of Hargrove Development for 19 years. She had negotiated contracts that made grown men cry. She had taken depositions that lasted 4 days and ended careers. My son called her the Iron Curtain, which was meant as an insult but which Margaret considered a compliment. She answered on the second ring. She didn't say hello. She said, "I've been waiting for this call." I told her everything. The conversation by the bar, the glass, the attorney Natalie had mentioned. My voice was steady, which surprised me, because my hand was shaking slightly against the phone. There was a pause on the other end. the kind of pause that precedes a calculated response rather than an emotional one. "Tom," she said, and her voice had dropped to the register she used when the situation was genuinely serious. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to stay calm." I told her I was already calm. "3 weeks ago," she said, "I found a discrepancy in the development account, the one Brendan has signatory access to for the Asheville project. $42,000 moved to a vendor I didn't recognize. I've been running it down quietly because I wanted to be certain before I brought it to you. I'm certain now." I looked at the wall in front of me. Someone had hung a framed print of a hunting dog there, which seemed like a strange choice for a corridor behind a kitchen. "The vendor," I said. "Let me guess. Simmons Property Group," she said. "Registered in Natalie's maiden name. Her father Frank is listed as the managing member." I had met Frank Simmons 4 times. He had a firm handshake and an expensive watch, and the particular confidence of a man who had never been held accountable for anything. At the engagement party, he had told me he was in real estate development, which I had taken at face value, because I had been too busy being a proud father to ask follow-up questions. "How long?" I asked. "I can only verify the last 8 months, Margaret said. "But the structure suggests it's been running longer." "Tom, Brendan has been using operational funds. Not the trust. Not his personal allowance. The company's operating accounts." I sat with that for a moment. "There's more," she said. "There is always more." She told me she had received a call that afternoon from my attorney, David Park. Natalie's family had retained a guardianship specialist 2 weeks ago. They had been gathering documentation. Brendan had submitted a statement describing episodes of confusion and erratic financial decision-making on my part, the kind of language that, accumulated and presented to the right judge, could be used to argue that I was no longer fit to manage my own affairs. The lake house wasn't the end of what they wanted. The lake house was just the first door they planned to open. I stood up from the chair. "Margaret," I said, "how far away are you?" "I'm in the parking lot," she said. "I've been here for an hour." I almost laughed. "You knew," I said. "I suspected," she said. "Bring me in when you're ready. I have David with me. We have paperwork." A brief pause. "Tom, I also have the Asheville audit, all 40 pages." I buttoned my jacket. I straightened my tie. I had built 37 buildings in this county, and I had negotiated the largest commercial real estate deal in the region's history over a handshake and a cup of bad coffee. And I had not gotten to 65 years old by flinching at the moment when flinching cost you everything. "Give me 10 minutes, I said. "Then come in through the main entrance." "Understood," she said. "Dress like you're here to foreclose on something," I said. "I always do," she said. I hung up and stood in the corridor for a moment. I thought about Patricia. I thought about the way she used to sit on the back porch at the lake house in the early morning before anyone else was awake, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, watching the mist come off the water. I thought about the last time we were there together, 3 months before she died, when she had squeezed my hand and said that someday this would all belong to someone who loved it the way we did. She meant a grandchild eventually. She did not mean Frank and Carol Simmons. I walked back into the ballroom. The party had recovered somewhat in my absence. The string quartet was playing again. The waiters were circulating with the appetizers. Natalie was at the head table talking to her mother Carol, who was wearing a dress that cost more than the lake house's annual property tax and had been, I now understood, purchased partially with my company's operating budget. Brendan saw me come in. He stood up quickly, which I noted. Not with relief, but with the alertness of a man who had been waiting to manage a situation. He crossed the room toward me. His face was composed in the expression I recognized as his damage control face, the slightly apologetic half-smile he had been using since he was 16 and had put a dent in my truck. "Dad," he said quietly, "I think we got off on the wrong foot tonight. Natalie's just stressed. She didn't mean." "Does she know about the audit?" I said. His face went very still. "The Asheville project," I said. "Simmons Property Group. $42,000. Does she know I know, or were you planning to tell her?" The color left his face slowly, the way paint fades in sunlight. He opened his mouth and then closed it again. He looked past me toward the head table, where Natalie was laughing at something Carol had said, and something complicated and ugly moved through his expression. "Dad, that's not he started. It's a conversation for a different room, I said. Not here. Not yet. He nodded, grateful for the deferral, which was a mistake on his part. He thought the deferral was mercy. It wasn't. It was positioning. I went back to the head table. I sat down. I accepted a glass of wine from a passing waiter, and I smiled at Ellen across the table, and she gave me the look she had been giving me since she was 4 years old, the one that said she knew exactly what was happening, and she was ready to help if I needed her. I gave her a small shake of my head. Not yet. Natalie watched me settle back into my chair with a satisfaction she didn't bother to hide. She thought the old man had gone to the hallway to collect himself and had come back ready to negotiate. She reached across the table and patted my hand in a gesture that was so precisely calibrated to appear loving while meaning the opposite that I had to remind myself not to pull away. "Tom," she said warmly, "I know tonight has been a lot. I hope you know everything we said was coming from a place of love." "I know," I said. She smiled. I checked my watch. 7 minutes. I excused myself once more, this time to the podium at the front of the room where the microphone stood. I had planned to give a short speech, something about gratitude and getting older and the particular gift of being surrounded by people you love. I had written 3 drafts, and none of them had felt exactly right. Now I understood why. I had been writing the wrong speech. I tapped the microphone once. The room settled. "Thank you all for being here," I said. "I mean that in a way I haven't always meant it. When you get to 65, you start to understand which rooms you actually want to be in, and which ones you've been politely attending out of habit. Tonight, looking out at this room, I know which one this is." A murmur of appreciation. Ellen was watching me carefully. "I want to introduce someone," I said. "She wasn't on the original guest list, and I apologize for the surprise. But she's here on important business, and I think it's better that this particular business be conducted in the open, in front of the people who matter to me, rather than quietly, in a back room somewhere, the way some things have been conducted recently." I nodded toward the main entrance. The doors opened. Margaret Voss walked in. She was 52 years old, and she moved through the room the way a cold front moves through August, which is to say that the temperature changed before she arrived. She wore a dark charcoal suit and carried the kind of leather briefcase that signals to anyone who has ever been on the wrong side of a conference table that the conversation is about to become very specific. Behind her came David Park, my attorney, and 2 associates I recognized from his firm, and behind them, a man I had not expected but recognized immediately, a detective from the County Financial Crimes Unit named Greer, whom David had apparently thought to bring along. Natalie saw Margaret, and her smile became uncertain. Frank Simmons, seated 3 tables back, saw Detective Greer and stood up slightly from his chair before sitting down again. Brendan, still standing near the side wall where I had left him, went the color of old concrete. Margaret reached the podium. I stepped aside. She set her briefcase on the podium, opened it with a sound like a judge's gavel, and removed a document bound in a blue legal cover. She did not take the microphone. Her voice carried without it. "Good evening," she said. "My name is Margaret Voss. I'm the Chief Legal Officer of Hargrove Development and a designated trustee of the Hargrove Family Trust. I'm here because a matter has come to my attention that requires immediate disclosure to the trust's beneficiaries and, given the specifics of the matter, to certain members of law enforcement." She opened the document. Natalie stood up from the head table. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp. "This is a private event. Whatever business you think you have here, this is not the time or the place." Margaret turned and looked at Natalie with the expression of a woman who has spent 19 years looking at people who are wrong about what they can and cannot stop from happening. "Mrs. Hargrove," she said, "please sit down." Something in Margaret's voice, the specific temperature of it, the complete absence of apology made Natalie sit. "Over the past 8 months," Margaret continued, addressing the room, "funds from the operating account of Hargrove Development have been transferred in 47 separate transactions to an entity registered as Simmons Property Group. The total amount transferred is $216,000. The room made a sound, not loud but unified. The sound of 200 people recalibrating. I watched Frank Simmons. He had his hands flat on the table, and he was very still. "Simmons Property Group," Margaret said, "has no employees, No active projects, no licensed operations, and no physical office. It is registered at a residential address in Greenville, South Carolina. Its sole listed purpose, per the registration documents, is the quotation, consultation, and advisory services to affiliated development entities. The only affiliated development entity to which it has ever provided anything is Hargrove Development, and the only thing it has provided is invoices. She lifted a second document from the briefcase and held it up. I have here the full audit, compiled by an independent forensic accounting firm retained by the Trust's board of directors. I also have an affidavit from the bank verifying the transaction history, and I have a signed authorization from the Hargrove Family Trust Board directing that all accounts and assets connected to the unauthorized transfers be frozen pending a full review. She set the documents down and looked at Brendan. My son was standing by the wall. He wasn't moving toward me anymore. He wasn't moving toward his wife. He was standing very still with his arms at his sides and his eyes on the middle distance, the way a man stands when he is trying to locate an exit that doesn't exist. I walked toward him. I didn't cross the room quickly. I had nowhere urgent to be. The party was, for all practical purposes, over. The caterer had stopped moving. The string quartet was watching with their instruments in their laps. Ellen was standing now, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wet. I stopped in front of my son. He looked at me, and I want to be honest about what I saw in his face, because I have been dishonest with myself about him for a long time. I saw fear, yes, but underneath it, I saw something I recognized. I had seen it in boardrooms, and in contract negotiations, and in the faces of men who had been caught cutting corners on load-bearing structures. It was the look of a man who had known, somewhere beneath the justifications and the self-serving logic, that what he was doing was wrong. The look not of someone who had made a mistake, but of someone who had made a choice. How long? I asked. He looked at the floor. Brendan, I said. 14 months, he said. His voice was almost inaudible. 14 months. Brendan had been moving money from the company I had spent 30 years building for 14 months. His wife's family had been collecting it in installments, sitting at my table and eating my food and planning the next step, which was the guardianship petition, which would have allowed them to legally remove me from control of my own life before I understood what was happening. Did Natalie ask you to start it? I said. Or was it your idea? He was quiet for a long moment. She said her father needed help, he said finally. She said he had some debts. She said just once. Just a bridge loan. We'd pay it back. And then it just... He stopped. I know that's not an explanation. No, I said. It isn't. Dad, I'm sorry. His voice broke on the word. I know what that sounds like right now. I know you don't. The forgetfulness, I said. The episodes. The statements you gave to their attorney about my mental competence. He closed his eyes. Did you write those yourself, I said, or did she write them and you signed them? He didn't answer, which was its own answer. I looked at him for a long time. I looked at the curve of his jaw that was the same curve as Patricia's jaw. The thing about him that had made me catch my breath sometimes when he was a boy, the physical reminder of her in him. I had spent 14 months not knowing, and in all that time I had been congratulating myself on the kind of father I was. The generous one. The one who never made his son ask twice. I love you, I said. I want you to understand that the thing I'm about to do comes from that and not from its absence. He opened his eyes. I turned away from him and walked back to the podium. Margaret stepped aside, and I took the microphone. Some of you have done business with me for decades, I said. You know that I've tried to operate with a certain standard of transparency. I'm going to apply that standard tonight, even though it's harder to do with family than it is with a contractor. I looked out at the room. 200 faces, some confused, some quietly horrified, some with the careful, neutral expression of people who are witnessing something they will be discussing for the next several years. The Hargrove Family Trust, I said, will be undergoing a full restructuring effective immediately. My son's employment with Hargrove Development is terminated, effective tonight, pending the outcome of the financial investigation. The supplemental benefits associated with his employment, the housing subsidy, the company vehicle, the expense account, are all suspended as of this moment. I paused. I want to address something directly to the Simmons family, I said. Frank, Carol, you're welcome to finish your dinner. But the suite at the Cliffside Inn that was charged to the company account will be releasing you tomorrow morning. Detective Greer will be in touch about the audit. I'd recommend getting counsel before that conversation. Frank Simmons had not moved. Carol's hand was on his arm. Across the table, Natalie was standing with her glass still in her hand, her face doing something complicated. I also want to address the guardianship filing, I said. The room went very quiet. I am 65 years old, I said. I have low-grade hypertension, which I manage with medication, and by not eating too much of the sea bass, which is excellent, by the way. And I'd encourage everyone to have some. I am not confused. I am not erratic. I'm a man who trusted his son with access to his company, and I'm a man who's standing here tonight, making a deliberate decision with full comprehension of its consequences. Anyone who wants to dispute my mental competence is welcome to try. Margaret's number is on the Hargrove Development website. A sound moved through the room that was almost, though not quite, laughter. I set down the microphone. Natalie came toward me then. She had abandoned any pretense of the performance she had been maintaining all evening. Her face was bare and hard, and genuinely furious in the way that people are furious when they have been planning something for a long time and watched it collapse in the space of 20 minutes. You had no right, she said. Her voice was low and fast. You did this to humiliate us. You didn't have to do it here, in front of everyone. You could have come to us privately. We could have worked something out. Could we? I said. You're going to destroy your son's life over money, she said. Over an apartment subsidy and some expense account transfers. Do you know what that says about you as a father? It says, I said, that I finally stopped letting the fear of that question make my decisions for me. She stared at me. The lake house, I said. You asked me for the lake house tonight. And I want to tell you what that house is, because I don't think you actually know. It isn't a second property. It isn't a real estate asset. My wife planted rose bushes on the north side of the property the summer before she died, and they came back last spring without anyone tending them. I sat on that porch on her birthday in April and watched them and cried for about an hour, and it was one of the best hours I've had in 2 years. You don't get that house. Natalie's jaw tightened. She looked at Brendan, who was still standing near the wall. Something passed between them that I think was the final accounting of what they had lost. Because she looked at him with the expression of a person looking at a bad investment, and he looked at her with the expression of a person who had just understood, too late, that the most expensive thing he had ever purchased was the diminished version of himself that she had required. She left without saying anything to me. She collected her bag from her chair, and she walked to the main doors, and she did not look back at Brendan. The doors closed behind her. The room was silent for a moment. Then Ellen was beside me. She put her hand on my arm and I put my hand over hers, and we stood there while the room slowly began to find its breath again. Dad, she said quietly. I know, I said. Are you okay? I thought about it honestly, the way I had been making myself think about things lately, since Patricia died and I had been forced, by the absence of the person I had spent 40 years being honest with, to practice the habit more deliberately on my own. I think so, I said. Ask me again in a few weeks. She nodded and stayed beside me, while the guests around us began to make the movements of people preparing to leave, the quiet retrieval of jackets and purses, the subdued goodbyes, the particular kindness that people extend when they have witnessed a private wound, made public, and they want to honor it by not making it a spectacle. Margaret found me near the exit as the room cleared. She had already spoken with Detective Greer, and had the quiet efficiency of a person who has accomplished what she set out to accomplish. She handed me the blue-covered document. For your records, she said. I took it. It was heavier than it looked. The trust restructuring, I said. How long will it take? 6 weeks, she said. Maybe 8. There's a lot to untangle. But Tom, she paused in the way she rarely did. The charitable foundation you mentioned last year, the one for trade apprenticeships. If you still want to move forward with that, now would be a clean time to do it. The assets are going to be reevaluated anyway. It might be the right moment to make some decisions about where things go. I had mentioned the foundation once, over coffee, 18 months ago. She had remembered it and filed it away and carried it here tonight. Because that was the kind of woman Margaret Voss was. I thought about the apprenticeship program I had run informally for years. Young men and women from the county who had shown up to job sites without experience and left with skills and, sometimes, with careers. 3 of them now ran their own firms. One of them had built the pavilion in the park where Patricia and I used to walk on Sunday mornings. "Let's do it," I said. She nodded, and something in her expression shifted slightly, just enough to be visible. "Good," she said. Outside, the October night was cool and clear. I stood on the steps of the country club while the valets brought cars around, and the last guests filtered past with their brief condolences and their careful sympathy. Ellen and her husband waited with me until my car arrived. She hugged me for a long time before she got in theirs. I drove home alone along the highway that ran beside the river. The water was black and silver in the moonlight, and the trees on the far bank were still holding their last leaves. I thought about Brendan. He was staying in a hotel tonight, according to Margaret, who had already arranged for the company car to be collected from the parking lot. He had called Ellen twice while I was saying goodbye to the last guests. He had not called me, which was probably wise, and also, I thought, a first step toward understanding that consequences are not negotiable, which was the thing I had spent 34 years failing to teach him. I would talk to him. Not tonight, and not next week, but eventually. When the legal process had run its course, and the air had cleared, and we were both ready to have a conversation that was honest rather than strategic. I did not know what would come of it. I did not know if the version of my son that existed on the other side of this would be someone I could rebuild something with, but I knew I would try, because he was Patricia's son as much as mine, and because love is not something you choose to stop feeling just because it stops being convenient. What I was done with was the pretending, the looking away from the things that were obvious because seeing them clearly would require action. And action was hard. And the status quo, however dishonest, required nothing of me but my silence and my checkbook. That version of me had been left in the corridor behind the kitchen of the Oak Ridge Country Club, sitting in a chair with a sore hip, trying to remember the sound of his wife's laugh. I turned off the highway and onto the county road that led home. My house sat on a hillside with a view of the valley and 3 oak trees in the front yard that I had planted with Brendan when he was 7 years old. The kind of memory that makes you understand why none of this is simple, why love and disappointment occupy the same space without canceling each other out. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment. In 2 weeks, I was driving up to the lake house. I was going to sit on the back porch and watch the water in the early morning the way Patricia used to, with a cup of coffee and nothing planned until afternoon. I was going to look at the rose bushes on the north side and think about her, and it was going to hurt, and I was going to let it. And then I was going to drive back down the mountain and go to the office and start building something. I had done it before. I knew how. I got out of the car and walked toward the house. And the night air smelled like wood smoke and cold grass. And somewhere down the road a dog was barking at something only it could see. And the stars over the valley were very bright. And I was 65 years old, and I was, without question, still here.